Good morning. Hello, everyone. My name is Luciana Gama Muniz. I am Project Director at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, CEBRI. Our event today is a partnership with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome all of you to discuss if climate change denialism and anti-democratic policies block multilateralism. This webinar is part of a larger project on the reorientations of multilateralism that CEBRI has been developing with CAS for the last 2 years. I would like to give a very, very welcome to Professor Carlos Milani, who is a senior fellow at CEBRI and Deputy Director of the Institute for Social and Political Studies at the Rio de Janeiro State University. Professor Carlos will lead us through this conversation today. But before we start the debate and I'll pass the floor to Carlos, I would like to invite Aline Soares, who is a project coordinator at CAS. Aline, please feel free to give your welcome remarks on behalf of CAS.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to welcome you all who are watching us today and also greet our guests for this opportunity to debate this very important topic. Konrad Adenauer Foundation is an independent, non-profit German political foundation and has been working in Brazil for over 50 years. The main goals of the foundation are to promote democracy, the rule of law, human rights and political education, as well as social market economy, decentralized and sustainable development. CAS Brazil has projects in different thematic fields, numerous activities, publications, especially in the area of international cooperation, decentralization, and sustainability. It's crucial that we debate the issue of climate change, especially in the current international context. It is evident that humanity needs to change the way it relates to the environment. By denying this need, makes the effect of climate change even more dangerous for the entire international community. In addition to this debate, the anti-democratic policies also become a global issue as they directly affect the dialogue between institutions and countries, hindering agreements and partnerships. So it's an honor for Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and I'm sure it's for CEBRI also, to count on your enthusiasm to praise this event with the presence of renowned speakers working in Brazil and abroad about do climate change denialism and anti-democratic policies block multilateralism? So I wish you all an excellent debate, and now I'll pass the floor to Carlos Milani. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Luciana and Aline, for this wonderful introduction. Aline has just given us the title of our conversation today, which is, do climate change denial and anti-democratic policies harm multilateralism? And to try to provide answers or hypotheses and interpretations to this broad question, we have today three very interesting guest speakers. The first one, and I'm going to present them very quickly because their respective CVs are very, very, very long. I'd like to thank the three of them to be here with us in this conversation. The first one who's going to give us his view on how climate change denial and anti-democratic policies may harm multilateral negotiations is Timmons Roberts. Timmons is an Nicholson professor of environmental studies and a professor of environment and society and sociology at Brown University in the United States of America. He's also the executive director of the recently established, I think it's a little bit more than 1 year, Climate Social Science Network. He has taught and directed environmental science and policy programs at Brown, at the College of William and Mary, and at Tulane University. And his research focuses mainly on the politics of climate change. And he's obviously the co-author and the author of many edited volumes and articles that we can find on Google and on his personal webpage. Secondly, we are going to have here with us Professor Ruth McKee. She's a senior lecturer in criminology at the Montfort University in the United Kingdom. And her PhD thesis, which is also the title, or more or less the title of her book, is called Rebranding the Climate Change Counter Movement, a critical examination of counter movement messaging through a criminological and political economic lens. And she has also written several articles. One of the last ones is a cross-national analysis predicting the number of climate change counter-movement organizations across countries. She has also done some research in Brazil, which is one of her favorite countries to study. And she works at the School of Applied Social Sciences at the Montfort University. She's also one of the coordinators of the Global South Working Group within the Climate Social Science Network at Brown University. And finally, we're going to have Anna Toni, who is an economist, and she's also a PhD in political science. I'm very honored because she took her PhD at my institute under the supervision of our dear Maria Regina Soares de Lima, and she's currently the executive director of the Institute for Climate and Society, ICS, as it is very well known here in Brazil. In the past, she served as the first executive director of Action Aid in Brazil. She was the representative of the Ford Foundation for several years here in Brazil. And in 2011, she was the chairman of the board of directors of Greenpeace International. She has lots of experience in the civil society arena, and she's going to bring some light to our conversation today. And she's also, of course, senior fellow at CEBRI, just like me. And well, having said that, welcome everyone to this conversation, and let's quickly start, and I pass over the floor to Timmons.
Thank you, Carlos. Bom dia para todo mundo aqui. Muito obrigado por me convidar. I want to thank Nana, Mariana, Luciana, Bettina, and Aline, and CEBRI in general. So thank you all. I did my doctoral research in the Brazilian Amazon back in 1989, 1990, 1991, a long time ago, a lifetime ago. And I was at Johns Hopkins University, and I was also affiliated with the UFIPA, the Federal University of Pará. And since then, I've been working on climate change. So 30 years now. I brought students to the UN climate negotiations. For years, I studied the tensions between the global north and the global south, the wealthy and the poorer countries, the developed and the underdeveloped, less developed countries. And then in 2017, when my president, Donald Trump, withdrew from the Paris Agreement, which we had been watching and participating in the drafting and agreement of that, I realized that we needed to go back home to understand these issues of climate denial, climate delay, and obstruction in the United States. So I'm going to pull up my slides now and get going. Okay. Are you all seeing my screen? And I need to move this over so I can put it in presentation mode. Carlos, is that, oh, that's the wrong mode, right? Is that good? You're seeing the full screen?
Very good.
Okay. So there I am. Again, I'm at Brown University, as Carlos said. There's my email. I'll show it again at the end in case you want to be in touch, and I hope you will. So I'm going to talk a little bit of definitions. I'll try to be as quick as I can, talking about misinformation versus disinformation, denial versus obstruction. And then what's happening now is that we're not seeing denial of the reality of climate change, but rather discourses of delay on why acting is too difficult or why we shouldn't do it. I'll talk a little bit about the structures of climate obstruction. That is, what are the organizations that are blocking action? I'll talk a little bit about the UN framework on climate change, framework convention, the UNFCCC, and how it is influenced, who influences it and how. And then I'll talk about your topic today. This is all to get to the topic of authoritarianism. And I'll argue that authoritarianism really reduces the pressure from the populace, from the population, the citizens, to act on issues like climate change, and allows influence by especially extractive firms and their allies. So just to get started, misinformation is misleading information created or shared without intent to manipulate people. So for example, if you heard a rumor that a celebrity had died and you shared it, even on the social media or with your friends, then it would be misinformation if it was not true. And then you find out it's false and you can correct yourself. But disinformation is deliberate intent to confuse or manipulate people with dishonest information. So these campaigns of disinformation are often orchestrated by groups. In our case, outside the United States, there's a Russian troll factory. They can be coordinated across multiple social media accounts and platforms. They can use automated systems called bots, you've probably heard of, to post and share information online. Disinformation can turn into misinformation when it's spread by many people who are unwitting. That is, they don't know that the material is false and they go ahead and share it. So disinformation can lead to a lot of misinformation. I want to talk about our climate social science network, which is here on the right. You can see our cssn.org is our website. And this is from a piece by Robert Bruhl, who's my colleague and co-director. He's sort of the director of the research side. And he's pulled this together really from a lifetime of his own research on the climate denial and obstruction efforts. And it's complicated. Most people know about Exxon and the Koch brothers, but they don't know really that it's far more complicated than that. So the thing that, interests would like to influence is policy outcomes. Are you seeing my cursor over here on the right? So the policy outcomes are, what the government decides to do. There's many routes to influence that. You can try to influence it directly through the media, through the public, but much of it is really influenced through the political bodies, the legislature, and the presidency, prime ministers, and so on, parliaments. Unfortunately, I can't see my own presentation screen. Now, there's a lot of routes to influence that. There's lobbying firms, there's campaign funding. We have these things called political action committees. There's, trade associations can try to directly influence them. There's think tanks. There's even university programs that develop the ideas that are then presented by the think tanks and then pushed into the political agenda as a legitimate approach to deal with complex social problems like climate change. Often behind many of these things are advertising agencies. Whoops, I've now gone too far. So advertising agencies or public relations firms, we're learning, are extremely important actors in climate denial and climate obstruction networks. They're often the ones who are hired by, for example, trade organizations or directly by corporations to orchestrate campaigns. They often will create what are called astroturf groups. So false grassroots groups that look like they're local and representing workers or communities' interests, when in fact they're often simply representing the interest that's behind it all. And the interest that's often behind it are large corporations interested in the continuation of the status quo, that is the dependence on fossil fuels in our economy, which are responsible for the majority of climate change, changing gases. So I hope that's enough of that. It's all available in a 5-page briefing paper that talks about these about 15 actors, and I'm happy to send other links to people. Whoops. So just to clarify, there's climate change denial and there's climate change obstruction. So climate change denial is rejecting the idea that climate change is caused by human activity and it's occurring, or that it constitutes a significant threat to human welfare. So we've seen a lot of steps backwards in argumentation. People were saying, oh, it's not happening. Then they were saying, oh, it's happening, but it's not human caused. Then they were saying it's happening, it's human caused, but it's not bad, it actually is good. And then they're saying, you know, it's happening, it's human caused, it's bad, but we can't really do anything about it. So there's a whole series of arguments that have been put forward by right-wing think tanks, often funded by fossil fuel interests. Climate obstruction, though, is a bigger category. And then we call that the intentional slowing or blocking of policy or action on climate change. That is action that would be at a pace that would be commensurate with the current scientific consensus of what's necessary to avoid dangerous human-caused interference with the climate system. So that's been really our focus in the Climate Social Science Network. So intentionally slowing or blocking policy or action. One way is to intentionally block policy is what we call discourses of climate delay. So this is from a paper led by Will Lamb, who's in Switzerland, and a bunch of internationals, mostly European group of co-authors. And we talked about 4 types of discourses of climate delay. And this is a very new idea and is sort of a typology that we thought was quite useful. So there's 4 types. I'll start at the top. So one way is that you can, to avoid responsibility, is to redirect it at somebody else. So this is sort of pointing at anybody but yourself. So whataboutism is often saying, well, China is the largest emitter, India, you know, this is what we hear in the United States. I know in other countries it's, well, the United States is the largest emitter, so we shouldn't do anything about it. We don't have to. We're a small country, we're a tiny part of the problem. Individualism say, well, individuals should change their behaviors, so we shouldn't institute strong laws. The free rider's excuse is often, you know, well, other people are not doing enough, so we shouldn't do enough either. There's a whole bunch of non-transformative solutions here on the right, you know, believing that there's going to be a technological fix that's going to come along and solve the problem. There's many groups are saying, you know, we're working on climate change, we're solving the problem. For example, there's been, you know, some compilations comparing the amount spent on drilling and exploring for oil reserves by oil corporations versus how much they spend on renewable fuels like algae, biofuels, and so on. There's really a lot of arguments now that, well, we need natural gas to be a bridge fuel. So we should keep building with that, when in fact natural gas leaks and is, you know, 20 or 80 times worse than carbon dioxide if it leaks. So is often not a solution, and especially not if we have to get entirely off of fossil fuels by 2050 and reduce our fossil fuel use by 50%, 45 or 50% by 2030. There's also a lot of groups saying, well, we should have all market mechanisms or all incentives and no regulation and so on. But one of the, so I won't go through all these, but what we're hearing more is this surrender discourse, that it's too late, don't worry about it, it's over, let's just forget it. It's, you know, this is ironic because some of that's coming from the same actors who said we shouldn't act. But then there's also, we're hearing a lot of this well-being and social justice. These are almost often the most heard things. So we'll hear from the real estate industry we've found in the United States is, and developers are saying, well, if you require energy efficiency in homes, that will make those homes more expensive, and that will exclude working families and the poor and people of color from being able to afford housing, which of course excludes the fact that they will benefit year after year from lower energy costs. So here's the original figure from that paper. I've just talked through most of it. So just to for reasons of time, I'll move on to the UN CCC, or the UN climate negotiations process. So this is I'm just kind of laying out some initial thoughts on this. I'll leave it more for the debate, but I go to these negotiations. Again, I've stopped going in 2017 when President Trump withdrew from Paris, but now I'm going again this year because I think it's quite important to raise these issues of climate obstruction. So non-governmental organizations or civil society organizations of many types and businesses come to the conferences of the parties and they seek to influence the negotiations. But I've seen that, in fact, most of the influence is really being driven back in national capitals. So back home, there's the nations in the talks are organized in key negotiating groups, the G77, the least developed countries, the Association of Small Island States. The umbrella group is the sort of US, Australia, Canada group, sometimes called juice cans. The European Union, the Environmental Integrity Group, I should say BASIC as well. I was just listing these. If BASIC is still acting, the Brazil, South Africa, India, and China group. But those national positions are, as I said, driven by power politics back in the national capitals. And those methods of influence include what I had back two or three slides ago about protests, lobbying, testimony, campaign contributions, public and elite influence campaigns, and direct payments or bribery of public officials in foreign affairs ministries or in other parts of the government that make this policy. So I would argue that one of the key factors is the dependence of a country on natural resource extraction. These are often resource extraction. This is a piece from Tony Bebbington, who's a geographer here in the United States, who argues that resource extraction is associated often with enormous rents or income that reflects the immense market power of those who extract resources and control their trade. These rents elicit forms of behavior and social organization that can be so powerful as to transform state, society, and economy in ways that are often beneficial only to those small segments of the population that benefit. And these assemblages have massive and largely adverse consequences for the quality and the possibilities of democracy. And this is, sort of the paradox of plenty, as has been called, the sort of curse, the resource curse. If you have a lot of natural resources, it's been the history of a lot of Latin America, having great mining, other natural resources, oil and gas, can often lead to dependence on one resource, which then means one sector takes over the government and there's often no accountability to the population. So I'm on my last slide, and that is just talking about what happens is that climate change presents a very tough problem. Dale Jameson emailed me the other day and said, I have a paper about your topic for this debate about does climate change denialism and authoritarianism block multilateralism. He says, well, actually, I said, that it actually, democracy is very difficult for multilateralism. And he says, we need this very strong multilateral approach to solve the problem. And but democracies are sort of damned if they do, and they're damned if they don't. That is, if they fail to successfully address climate change and other problems of our current ecological crisis or the Anthropocene, their legitimacy will be challenged. But if they too aggressively attempt to address them, their legitimacy will also be challenged. So either way, we can expect the power of populist figures and movements to grow. So I'm sort of throwing this out as just a paradox and a difficulty for countries as we deal with the big question in this debate. And I think there's so much at stake. I mean, everything really is at stake. And I appreciate you having me. I look forward to the discussion. I hope I helped a little bit in setting the topic up for a discussion.
Thank you so much, Timmons, for your presentation. There will be certainly several questions concerning this paradox between democracy's actions, multilateralism, and climate change needs for transformation. I'll give the floor now to Ruth McKee.
Well, you can all hear me, I hope. And obrigado. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. And I'm going to just add really to what Timmins has just put forward so far. But a bit of background. I've been working on climate change denial and what I would refer to as the climate change counter movement since about 2014, so for the past sort of 7 years. And my work is really centered on understanding climate denial, not just simply as a US phenomena, as a European phenomena, but to try and to understand it at a global level, as well as the differences between countries and how different discourses of delay, as outlined by Timmins, or obstruction activity takes place. And this is why I think that is very useful for today, because now I can give some insight and some examples, not only from a European case, but also how that ties into Brazil and what this means going forward. So I'll share my screen. That will work. And there we go. Hopefully you can see my screen there. Fabulous. So I'm going to just quickly cover some information around Europe and denial. There's a lot to cover, so I'm going to narrow it down a little bit to some more relevant parts. I'm then going to attach that and connect that with some information around climate denial in Brazil in a historical context, so from the early 2000s. Before adding or positing what this means, some questions that we'll hopefully debate towards the end. So to set the scene, I think, to help understand what obstruction and climate denial looks like in Europe and across different European countries, I think it's best to look at the politics side. So there are lots of obstruction actors across Europe that are very similar to the US. But I think what's relevant, most relevant here is the politics and the political environment at this, or that has happened over the sort of past 5 to 6 years. And in particular, you've got the rise of what we would call far-right parties across Europe. Now, these are not necessarily new parties. They might have been fringe groups. Some examples will include the Brexit Party in the United Kingdom, the Alternative for Germany Party in Germany, and the Forum for Democracy in the Netherlands or Holland. Now, prior to sort of 2015, there was evidence of denial, climate denial in the media through politicians, but it was very much a small minority, yet powerful minority group of people that could influence politics, from their relationships to fossil fuel companies to their relationships with the media. But what's actually become more prevalent since the rise of these far-right parties, and in particular, their access to the media and what we refer to as the echo chamber, that this language of both climate denialism, so some of those early climate skeptic arguments that climate change isn't happening, as well as more of those obstruction discourses identified, such as the social justice element, have also emerged and intensified both in politics, political statements, manifestos, as well as how they are reciprocated and then passed on to the public, and to which the public then make their political decisions. And what seems to connect these groups, what connects us all together, are some key points that will become relevant or seem to become relevant to why there may be barriers to multilateralism. Firstly, we think of the rise of populism, and I'm not too fond as an academic of the term populism, but that's how we might largely refer to this current moment in time and these particular far-right parties in Europe. This type of language promoted by certain politicians, certain political groups and related actors connects to some of that anti-refugee sentiment, anti-immigration. It also links with a form of protectionism and a rise in nationalism and nationalist attitudes. They also manifest very much in some racial, and we sometimes refer to some parties as racist in the language that they exert. Moreover, we also have certain values around traditional ways of life, social and cultural values that we would attribute often towards a patriarchal society, and in particular the reduced role and independence of women, the reassertion of a traditional family unit. And those traditional ideas also couple with the rise of climate denialism and the types of language and narratives used in Europe, and particularly far-right political parties. In particular, that reaffirming of patriarchal values often is presented as a form of misogyny in the media, often towards the Swedish activist Greta Thunberg. There's also this element of environmentalism as a new religion, as a religious group in and of itself. And what's also important, as we're of all of these different components of the far right in the language, is this important element of harming the little man. Now, those elements tie into, more broadly and generally then, an element of nationalism, the reassertion of independence. In the UK, we refer to it, since the European and the Brexit campaign, we refer to it as what we call Little Britain. So we are reaffirming our strength as an independent nation, where we have independent authority, not only of our borders, but in the way we create and devise policy, which include climate-related policy. And this is significant when it comes for international agreements and international collaboration. It includes challenging whether, for instance, we should be part of the Paris Agreement. So we saw Donald Trump remove himself from the Paris Agreement. Bolsonaro has previously articulated similar sentiments in the media. There's also in Europe resistance to the European Parliament and environmental and climate-related measures there. With some of those discourses of delay, we need to take control of our national resources. We shouldn't be beholden to international regulation. We can solve the climate crisis out by ourselves. And sometimes it's not even anti-environmentalism in a sense. Actually, some of this language can be more around conservation, and particularly conservation at a local level, where we can address the problems of the environment in our own country. And the last sort of addition I think I want to add to this section is that it gives then countries, governments, an opportunity or reasons to oppose, for instance, nationally defined contributions. These ideas, these ideological points, in essence, provide a case to reject international and collaborative action. And it's important to recognize that I've talked there about Europe, but there are existing connections and overlaps between delaying organizations, people that are obstructing action in Europe and in Brazil. So we can think about these international collaborative efforts to tackle climate change might be stalled by these obstruction movement actors. But in essence, these obstruction actors are collectively working as an international organization. Maybe it's very dynamic, maybe they might not be very consistent, but there is something that is connecting them all. And you can see, and we can observe networks of actors. So one example is a organization that is now defunct that brought together European think tanks, and in particular, several think tanks from across Latin America. And this is where those international collections and the dissemination of delaying ideas started to feed into a series of obstruction actors who, in some countries, especially in Europe and certain European countries, think tanks have a stronger reach and access to influence policy. And that had significant implications. And I'm going to draw your attention to something important here. So some of this language and delaying discourse that emerged between those connected actors from Europe and Brazil, as well as the US, they put something forward in a report that was placed and was made available across these different organizations. And there are 2 points to note, I think, that are very relevant here to this discussion and what might be barriers to multilateralism and actually addressing climate change collectively. They put it in 2 contexts, and there was some debates and discussions in this report on why we should not act on climate change. And this was in 2009. And back then, one side of the argument, industries in rich countries face punitive and expensive measures against climate change. Many fear they will be unable to compete with countries that do not have such emissions restrictions, and fear manufacturing and jobs will move away to them. So back in 2009, that was, you can see those elements of that protectionism there, and some of those we don't want to act, particularly from voices, or it's attributed to voices in Europe and the US. By comparing their actions, so we shouldn't act on climate change. So I'm in the UK, I shouldn't act on climate change. My country shouldn't act on climate change, because in other countries with very little emissions, then they can have all of our jobs. They'll be able to do what they want, and we will suffer as a case. On the other hand, you've got this other argument. But some rich countries are imposing their own carbon limits anyways and threatening to curb imports from poor countries that are not. We believe this will cripple the rich economies and harm the poorer countries without doing much about emissions. So unlike that first context, you've got a sort of different argument there, a similar but different one. We're saying that we cannot, or countries, and this was particularly referring to Brazil, some countries are imposing their carbon limits anyways. So that by saying that other countries who might be developing their own environmental and climate related legislation, as well as these multilateral agreements that particularly came out of the Copenhagen 2009 conference on climate change, if they impose restrictions on their own countries, those poorer countries, as stated here, or what we might think of as more overexploited and developing nations, will not be able to receive those imports. They won't be able to manage commodity chains. Economies will not run. Development and economic growth will no longer take place. So this conversation was happening in 2009. And you can see similar conversations happening in the media now. And through political conversations. So to summarize and bring together this discussion and quite a lot that I've covered there, I think I want to posit what that means and what that means for the conversation today. When I've looked and when I think about obstruction and delay and denial in Europe and then at a global level, I think, well, one of the key reasons behind that is the importance of promoting individual consumption, putting everything into individual consumers. So buying more goods, ensuring goods are available, supply chains are stocked. That individual consumption is part of a broader political and economic system that has given lifeblood to the fossil fuel, in particular, the fossil fuel industry's role of making sure that as a world, we rely on fossil fuels to fund our energy. That is coupled with language and discourses that are promoting a sort of defense of natural resource use, defense of ownership and nationalization and renationalization of fossil industries in some cases. And on the one hand, there are important conversations you can have and should have around renationalization and the use of natural resources. But when coupled with a far more complex social environment, there's cultural issues, there's also economic issues that are affecting that decision to renationalize. There are questions to be raised around that, and something that I think we need to talk about. There's also there's also something around development and what development looks like. The renationalization of resources, that protectionism and that defense, how that links with growth and a particular vision of economic growth are questions that need to be raised. And all three of these so far will influence in some way decisions at a nation state level and how that nation state chooses to engage in multilateral agreements. There's also something to think about and to consider in this context is the rise of social and cultural values that are sort of traditional, socially conservative and sometimes fiscally conservative, that rely on economic liberalism. It's a very complex mix of social, cultural, and economic values that are not meant to be together, but they have been aligned together to promote and support continued inaction on climate change. And in turn, this has the potential to slow, obstruct, and delay international and collaborative action on climate change. And I'm hoping that these ideas here and some of these points will offer some really interesting discussions going forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ruth. I think it was very interesting to listen to you about this second paradox that we could sum up as a kind of a denial narrative, a delay narrative that focus on local responses, but at the same time is extremely organized at the transnational level. I think this is interesting in terms of paradox. I'll give the floor now to Ana Toni, please.
Thank you, Carlos. Really happy to be here with you and obviously Ruth and teams. I think it's so nice because as we can see, and you have been like a leader on that, we have not many political scientists studying climate-related issues and phenomena, as we told in Brazil, unfortunately. Therefore, I'm really happy to having this conversation. As you said, I'm very honored to have had my PhD with you and Maria Regina, but I'm looking at this debate not really as an academic, but as somebody that has been working with climate-related issues since 1991 and have encountered many people with the attitude of denial. So I think in my observation on who are they and why are they around for so long, I will try to divide my talk on why have those more right-wing and why have they why we chose climate change as a denial issue. Why? There's so many issues, they could have chosen another one, but they chose climate. Why climate? Second, then bring to Brazil, to the Brazilian politics. Is that new here? Is that old? Then thirdly, does Bolsonaro brings new elements to what we are talking about in terms of denial? And obviously quickly looking at the future. If we look at the phenomenon, and I mean, I used to work for Greenpeace in the early 90s, and I mean, we were seen as like crazy people, really crazy people, not only by people that denied science, but by many of my left-wing friends was the same thing. Why are you working on environmental issues and climate change? This is not an issue that poverty is there, people are dying now. Why are we concerned about something that we are not even know about? So that was a type of denial with a different, but that denial grew, and that's what we are going to be talking about. Let us consider that it's not an easy issue. I mean, climate issues is not easy. There is no historical reference to it, differently from many other issues that we talked about, that we can look at the past to learn about the future. On the climate, you can't. So you have to have like faith on it, understand the science, and know what you needed to do. There is a lot of fear to change, normally, in any issue. And the types of changes we have been asked to deal with the climate issue, we asking a lot of changes, not little changes. And obviously, the tendency is for people to react against, obviously. Then there is also tons of economic interest. Pain, as Tim so well put it, I love that graphic you put, the structure of obscurantism. There is lots of money going into. Now, people are already afraid, people already don't understand, people already don't have reference, and you have people there with a lot of money for you to have a different position. Then you have also arguments about religion, which are genuine, like God made the planet as we have it, and who are we humans to play with God's art here? And we hear that time and time again of good people, not only people that deny. Then you have a lot of, as I think Bruce said, a lot of about nationalistic people that, no, climate change is really important, but it's a global problem, I'm interested. So many of those issues have been around for many years. They are not new. They're really not new. They were there and we had to face all of them. And obviously science, in any case, is something that relates to risk. It's not 100% all the time. So what I think the difference is now they chose climate. And why climate? First, it's based on science. No, it's based on science. And scientists are normally people that have the power of the knowledge and therefore normally don't create rules. That's clear. So if you don't like rules, you have to fight science. That's basic. Climate, it also requires cooperation, requires international cooperation. Now, it's a must. So obviously, if you are just a patriot, just only think about, you're not going, you have to go against thinking about climate. So your natural feeling will be, this is a globalistic, globalization, global blah, blah, blah that they talked about. So climate also brings that to us. Science, cooperation. And I think Ruth spoke a lot about that. Climate also requires that we change our path of development. It's putting in question the limit of nature. And for many people, that they're just status quo is what we want. So you have a mix of changing people's mindset to deal with an issue that's complex, that has no reference, with not wanting to change. And obviously with a machine as input of media and money to fill that thing up. And I think that combination of it now is what we are here talking about. I would not say that everybody that has doubted climate change in the past are bad people or had the bad intentions. Many have and are paying for it, but not all. They have different reasons for it, and it's not a hard issue for us to deal with. When we look at the politics of climate change and then denialism, what I think the difference has been in the US, climate change has always been a political party issue, from Democrats to Republicans. That was very much a US issue. It was very much a US issue. Obviously, Europe, with time, started political parties from the right to the left. That has not always been that way. Tim can correct me. Environmental issues used to be a Republican issue at early stage, and it changed with Reagan. It became a Republican issue, like for some of the reasons I talked about, especially climate and the fossil fuel industry in the US paying for it. But it has become a very polarized issue politically. I think the US way of looking at climate has been exported for many countries. Some of them the Bruce talked about. But then coming a bit to Brazil, if you look at the climate change debate policies in Brazil, that issue, yes, we have had tons of people that rejected from right and left in Brazil as a smaller issue, but the governments, be it Collor was the president when we had the Rio Summit, the Earth Summit in 1992. Then Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and then obviously Tamar, and then Lula, and then Dilma, even Temer. We had a lot of continuity. Temer, not much, but we had a lot of continuity from left to right on how those governments dealt with a little bit more here, a little bit less there, but there was continuity in terms of policy, better or worse. Some governments doing much more, others much less than that. I think Bolsonaro on the climate issue in Brazil is a disruption. And obviously it wasn't just because Bolsonaro, because those forces behind were growing very, very fast. And again, importing a lot of the knowledge and the infrastructure that Tim and Ruth talked about. So when we looked at, in the Brazilian case, how we tropicalized climate, the negacionism in Brazil was quite interesting. How we denied, how we internalized here. Obviously, the fossil fuel industry, first, Bolsonaro, look at Trump, and anything Trump say, do, he would just do it in Brazil. So if Trump left the climate convention, yeah, he had to look at climate as an issue to bring to obviously his political platform. Obviously, he was really backed up by many sectors in Brazil. Now, the oil and gas industry, the agribusiness industry, the agro, as not the agribusiness, the bad agribusiness industry. Obviously, there was a lot of support for him to do that. Again, a lot of support some of the religious groups, not because of different religious groups, just because that debate between science and religion in Brazil has always been a difficult one. And some churches, especially the neo-evangelic church, again, replicating what happened in the US, also brought the issue that we cannot, human beings could never play what God did. And that's also now changed. But I would say that that was very good for I mean, it was like, it was perfect for Bolsonaro to use because as we talked about, science are detectors of power because they have knowledge and they don't put rules. If you have a government so I need to first dispute reality because I need that institutions are going to be doubted. So if you start with the science, and climate was like a perfect match for them, you can take the credibility of all the institutions that were both built on that same reasoning. IBAMA, CONAMA, all of INPE, all the scientists that we had, if you are able to take their credibility, you are able to make those institutions less powerful, and obviously then do whatever you want, for example, deforesting the Amazon as quickly as possible, and giving with the excuse that the poor needs this, and this, trying to stop our development, and so on and so forth. We know quite well on how they did. And we know we have the same what I don't think, Tim, that we are as sophisticated on that structure of obscurancies that you talked about, but we have all those players now there in place in Brazil. Now, I don't think they were there in the past, but now they are well established. They have lobby in Congress, they have money to deal with. Now, all of that, but you talk, now we have in Brazil. However, that's the good thing about being a developing country. We are not as good as you are. We don't have as much money as you have. Our institutions don't have as much power than you have. So I would say that Bolsonaro and the government from Bolsonaro chose climate very much as a copy, because he's a populist, because he wanted to stop weakening some of those institutions, but he chose the wrong topic. I think he lost. That's my theory here. Why I'm saying that he lost? Because while Trump had the power, as a populist government, to impose and to give power to those interests, economic interests from the US, Bolsonaro, because Brazil depends on international trade, because of the different circumstances, so they have, first, he promised that he would take Brazil out of the climate change convention. He did not, first of all. He then said that he was going to end the environmental ministry. He did not. We can see Ricardo Salles, he's a minister that was very much on denying everything, very part of the denial movement linked to the US and Bannon and God knows what. He left. Am I saying that, no, the problem is over? No way. But what I'm saying is that trying to use climate in the same way that the movement of denial in the US, with the same political mindset, because you had this, that has not worked in Brazil. They are losing. Fortunately, doesn't mean I said that's good, but they are losing. So much so that now Joaquim Leite, the minister, is going to go to the next COP, is bringing a plan to implement our NDC, is going to propose a new NDC, so he's playing the game. He's playing the game of multilateralism, something that in the US, Trump decided not to. And now, to finalize the Bolsonaro, I think for the people that the negationists and the people that deny climate change, they understand fully how important Brazil is for their fights to continue in the world. So much so that I heard from Bannon, nobody but Bannon, that the Brazilian election next year is going to be one of the most important issues in 1992 for the ultra-right but conservative movements in the world. Because we have the Amazon, because obviously Bolsonaro is there, goes to the UN and talk about chloroquine and so on and so forth. So they understand that it's still a dispute in Brazil, and they will put a lot of all that money that Tim put it, show that all that infrastructure will be at the service of our negationists here. But just to finalize, let me jump to the UN and the future and the next COP, because I think now, are we going to see a lot of negationism in COP? I don't think so, because for the reasons that Tim and Ruth already talked about. First, they don't even go to the COP, but they send people to the COP and they put money through the COP. And that's quite clear that they will do that. What I think it has happened is the private sector realized they have a lot to lose on the climate prices. Insurance companies, the agribusiness in Brazil realize they will have no rain, no soya. So a lot of very rich people realize that they need to deal with the climate issue. So again, I think the denial, the people that are supporting the denying climate, they are losing power because of economic interest has changed. not because there are other interests of keeping the planet just clean. If the fossil fuel industry is still there, they will still, as you said, delay as much as they can, but they can less and less delaying the process. I don't think that's the biggest problem. I think one of the biggest problems are, first, the private sector, as we know, they will just say, okay, how can we make money out of climate change? That's what they're doing. So how can we make money? That's the interest first now. Not anymore denying, but how can I make money? Second, and again, I think something that Isabella Teixeira always talked about, the other side of fatalism is just no more time. No, climate change is already happening anyway. There is no more time. The UN will not, COPs and UN will not help us. We just needed either to find other ways, less democratic ones, to deal with the climate change, or just don't do anything and just use and abuse of the power, let us protect me. And the third, I think, very big danger there is to think that technology will save us. I think that's will save us. Definitely will not save us. So what's at stake? And go back to what I said, we are dealing with a really complex issue. Not everybody that denies are just bad people, but we are asking people to think in new models of development, consume different, stop thinking about growth. And it's hard because you have done that for 300 years, 200 years. So what's this new? People are afraid. So we are talking a lot about that. And when it comes to multilateralism, if we are talking about new models of development, if we're talking about new geopolitics, because it's no longer oil and gas, oil specifically, who had oil was the powerful. They are not going to be the powerful anymore in the future. Maybe us that have the forest, if we keep our forest, will be the powerful of the future. So you're changing geopolitics at the same time, and the governance structures have not changed. Now, people feel we need urgency, and people feel that the UN, obviously, and rightly so, give us progress, improvements. And I'm afraid, and that's the only multilateral place we have, so we have to protect it, because on yes, we need to move fast, but we need to move fast in a multilateral manner. There is no other way. There is no shortcut. And I think that's really important. And therefore, I don't think we can any longer look at just the global way of moving climate change. We needed to move down to the subnationals, to mayors and governors. And I do think us, the climate community, because it's a global issue, we have always worked on the global issues, obviously the national issues, and it's taking us too long to go to the bottom, to talk to people at the local level, to involve social movements, the Afro-Brazilian movement, the indigenous movement, the women's movement. They should be coming up and working on those issues. So, and they are the ones that are going to fight against the deniers, because they feel climate change is not a future problem, it's a local problem, it is a present problem here and now. And therefore, I think it's harder and harder. But those guys who always try, and they have a lot of money, and money is politics. So we are very aware of them, but we shouldn't just think that everybody is a puppet, because people are not. The society is not a puppet. We will need to also reach them out to them, communicate with them, use some of the communication tools that we had, but just doing the politics on the top is no longer an option. We will have to do the politics on the bottom, both in Brazil, but especially in the US, where I think this polarization has been so evident for all of us. Let me stop here. Thank you so much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Anna. I think that you have put your finger on the right knot of the question, saying that climate change is a question of development models, and changing development models, I mean, changing away from fossil fuel to renewable energies, new eco-social transitions, requires not only energy transition, but it's a whole question of how development is framed in the minds of decision makers and in the minds of individuals who consume, who produce, etc. We have already several questions from the audience, from our room, and I'm going to read some of them, but I'm going to make a very general comment, which is a kind of a 2 or 3 questions for all of you, and then you can react to each other's presentations before I read the questions coming from the audience. I think that in a sense, you have, the 3 of you, touched the issue of regulation and anti-regulation. And I think that this kind of dichotomy, which has, as Anna said, changed the way the Republican Party in the US thought of the environment and of climate change, occurred exactly with Ronald Reagan. And after Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party has changed its views. And of course, together with Margaret Thatcher on the other side of the North Atlantic, a whole movement, transnational movement, about the role of the state, about the role of the market, about the role of regulation, and a kind of a desire of a dreamed, non-regulated world emerged and transnationalized around the globe into politics, into policy making. And perhaps this sense of anti-regulation, even when we talk about market mechanisms to discuss climate change, take the carbon market, well, you have to trade, but you have to cap, right? And cap and trade supposes some forms of regulations concerning the limits of emissions on an annual basis if you want to progress. Then how can we move forward in terms of framing new development models if we do not abandon this anti-regulation sentiment, this kind of, I'm going to be provocative, that's my role here, this kind of anti-state, simplistic anti-state perspective that has, transnationalized around the globe. I think that second comment in question, this has also to do with another dichotomy which in international politics and in multilateral debates has been very present, which is the tension between sovereignty and the defense of our sovereign principles and foundations, both north and south of the globe, right? And the sense of responsibility and the principle of responsibility when we come to collective action. Right. And again, this second dichotomy, this second binary, sovereignty on one side and responsibility on the other side, in fact, what climate change emergency, what the climate change crisis is calling us upon is to reframe this dichotomy into something else. I don't like to talk about good or bad. I think that the world, we are all, all of us, we are a little bit good and a little bit bad. We are impure, and I think that that's part of the world, right? We are impures everywhere. But I think that defending sovereignty without a sense of responsibility towards the population, the community, towards nature, the ecosystem, is that acceptable? At the same time, being responsible and defining norms without taking into account the interests and the views of all the other sovereign countries, is that to be responsible, or is that to dictate responsibility and dictate and impose norms based on some views and on some interests, because they're always together, as we know, and on others. And I think that these two tensions, contradictions, regulation, anti-regulation, state, anti-state. I mean, many denial discourses and delay discourses, they always portray that environmental people are just like watermelons, right? They are green on the outside, but they are red in the inside. I think that these kinds of views, they refer to this simplistic dichotomy. And the other dichotomy, which is, I think, very simplistic too, is this binary between sovereign and responsibility. And of course, if you could react to this in a way, and always also reacting to each other's presentations before I move forward with many questions that come from the audience. I'll give you 2 minutes each, and then I'll read the questions from the audience. Timmons, then Ruth, and then Anna, if we follow the order.
I actually wanted to respond to some of the questions from the audience already, because I think they're great. I think Anna and Ruth both brought up the issue of sovereignty, and it's crucial. I mean, Anna, when you did your history, I would have gone back to Sarney, who, of course, had the Nossa Natureza what's the word? A cry, right? That Amazonia and Nossa. So the Amazon is ours, or our nature. So he was very nationalistic about responding to what he considered to be international demands to protect the Amazon. And his protection, I don't think, was based on the idea of wanting to protect the forests, right? He was interested in opening for development. Koller was really, remember, he went on a trip before he was inaugurated. After his election, he went around the world, and everybody asked him, all these presidents and prime ministers asked him, what are you going to do about the fires in the Amazon? And so he realized that he wasn't going to be able to take out loans, right, without addressing the Amazon problem, as they were calling it, right? So I agree that indeed moved, that was part of Brazil participating positively in multinational system, by hosting the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, a big deal. So the question really is, can the international system provide some pressure on nations and regimes to behave in a way that would move us towards more positive action on climate change? I'm looking at the Climate Action Tracker, the CAT, as they call it, Climate Action Tracker. You can Google it for seeing how they consider that Brazil is doing, and they rank Brazil as insufficient or highly insufficient. In other words, that Brazil's target that's been put forward in its nationally determined contribution, or NDC, is associated with about almost 4 degrees of warming world, which is just an unlivable world. So I hope that, and there's different ways to categorize this, and we've been in discussion with the group that designed this tracker, and I think they've made excellent improvements, and by having 2 different ways of showing it is very useful as well. So Brazil has reduced its emissions from some of its worst when things were worst in the Amazon, but it really has not proposed to do much better. So I don't think I'm really getting at your question here, Carlos. I agree with the paradoxes and the tensions between sovereignty and responsibility, and between regulation and anti-regulations. And I think you're right that the Reagan-Thatcher period is when really confidence in the governments of the world to do anything collapsed or was undermined, was destroyed. And in the US, we've really, because of this rise of what the Tea Party, which questioned all regulations and called for the rollback of state intervention and everything. Really, we have a country that's almost ungovernable. It's, you know, I think the more moderate interests in the Republican Party are very afraid that they feel that they've, you know, lost control of their party, and that it's now the country itself is unmanageable. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ruth. 1 minute, and then Anna. 2 minutes. 1, 2.
No, right. I'll go quickly. I'll respond, I think, to both. So I think, because you're right in terms of the dichotomy around regulation and anti-regulation, and certainly it does line or lead back to the Reagan and the Thatcher era. But I think what's even more important, because we've got this regulation versus anti-regulation dichotomy, the way that then plays out in terms of market economics and thus how markets can address climate change or not address climate change look very different. So depending on the particular, so politicians say that they are not ideologically driven, but their engagement in policy models or pushing certain economic models are often based on a particular form of philosophy and economic philosophy. And most of these and the dominant conversations come in some way, shape or form, or dominate based on the likes of Hayek, Milton Friedman, and they are quite what we say is hegemonic across countries. And depending on the type of philosophical approach that a country takes to their economic system and then its impact will impact policy. And certain lighter versions, I guess, where there is still room for the state and some regulations, prove to be some pathways towards climate action. But then that is dependent on other social, cultural factors, such as, so in Germany, you have a very positive, or what appears to be a very positive approach to climate action, but you are still following a type of economic model that not only follows a growth trajectory, but it is relying on mechanisms as well as a technological optimism that might not address climate change. And as countries have very different economic systems and a way they approach climate action domestically, without that, I guess, internationalization and international cosmopolitanism, a one society and a one economic system that's consistent across the globe, it will be very hard to implement, I would say, climate change action. And I think that then extends to that sovereignty idea and collective responsibility. As the world, as people across the world separate themselves from individuals, so as we remain not as, or we don't see ourselves as somehow connected not only to ourselves, to each other in our home environment, but nature and animals, until we start to reframe what is quite dominant across the world, a Western human exceptionalism paradigm, as that remains predominant, and a predominant discourse that also feeds into climate agreements. They are very human focused and individualistic focused. What individuals can do as well as individual nation states can do, unless that is replatformed as collectively, these ideas of sovereignty and protectionism will persist and cause problems, I guess, and delay a collective and actually very important collective effort.
Thanks, Ruth. Anna, please.
Let us go on the regulation or regulation. I am on, depends on the regulation. Really depends on the regulation. We have terrible regulation. For example, in Brazil, we not only regulate, but subsidize coal. We regulate and subsidize the export of some of the mining and agribusiness. So it's a bad regulation. So it's not a good or bad regulation. And you have great regulations. So I think it's, to say regulation good, regulation per se is good, or no regulation per se is bad, is obviously not what we are talking about. Is what we need is regulation first, based on science, based on data. And that is what we normally don't have. We have a lot of regulations based on interests. And normally, as we talked about, because of in climate, the power is still very much on heavily emitters, like fossil fuel, like the agribusiness. They have the power to influence, and their interest becomes the regulation. So I'm all for a good regulation. And again, good states or bad states. Some, like, do we want a strong state? No, whatever strong state mean, led by Bolsonaro or Putin, is a very strong state. So that's a good thing about political science, is that you really need to look at the players involved. And I would say the same about sovereignty. I think the notion of sovereignty is changing, should change. The notion of sovereignty, as you said, Carlos, it has to together with responsibility. And on climate, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So you have to, you can be very patriotic and have a strong sovereignty, like Brazil. We could be like seeing ourselves as a green sovereignty state, whatever, and be part of the solution. But to use sovereignty just to say, no, this is your problem. So I think it is how you use that and how you use that. But I think what we need, and I go back to science, because obviously then denial has so much to do with that, is denying of science very much, is that people see that before the theory of change was, I do good science, I give to good politicians, and they will do the right thing. It doesn't work. Science is also subject of politics, as now we realize very much so. And I wish we can go to good science in terms of, yes, do policies based on good science, do good regulations on that as well. Before I answer all the other questions that are there. Thank you.
We have the 3 questions coming from the audience. I don't know if we can have some 10 extra minutes from CEBRI, because we were supposed to finish at 12:30. I will read, and each of them is addressed to different panelists. To Timmons, Isabella Teixeira, who is a counselor at CEBRI, former Minister of Environment, she asks you, how does the current climate fatalism impact the Paris Agreement implementation and delay the climate transition? To Ruth, another CEBRI counselor, José Luis Alqueires, asks, what about the religious component against action? Like the introduction of Christianity in Europe stopped the pursuit of progress in science in the Middle Ages, for example. And to Anna, there is a question coming from, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, Kubo. how important is the discourse and how important are the actions regarding climate change in the 2022 election in Brazil? And I'll leave you with that. And please be as brief as you can, of course.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. So on fatalism, I think it's extremely worrisome that people are beginning to throw up their hands and say, well, we've already cooked ourselves and the planet. It's the worst thing we can do. Indeed, the science says that we are we're going to experience warming and disasters of all types that are getting worse and worse. And with the momentum in the system, with how long carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere, it's going to get worse. But it's going to be either worse or unlivable. And that's the choice right now, really, is if we take the action, strong action now, then we have a chance of avoiding unlivable. So fatalism, there's a really mistaken fatalism there, I think, that comes from assuming that we can't do anything. I think what I worry as much about is analyses that are, in fact, probably quite realistic. That, you know, politically, this is a very difficult issue, and there are very strong organizations and actors who are blocking action. As Bill McKibben said in our CSSN talk just a week or so ago, I mean, we all know that the end point that we're going to end up at is 100% renewable energy. The question is whether that happens in 2070 or 2100, or does that happen in 2050? So does it happen in 30 years or in 70 years? And the difference is whether we have a livable planet or not. So we cannot be fatalistic. We have to keep working on this. I hope that I think there's something happened this year that the disasters really affected wealthy people in a way they had not before, and in wealthier countries. And that is the only time that we've seen environmental issues addressed, really, is when those with wealth and power are experiencing the impacts, for example, of air pollution. In the United States, it was cleaned up when wealthy people couldn't move away. They realized they needed and clean water, that they needed to clean up the water and the air everywhere for them to experience it themselves. So that's my hope, is that this issue, we hope that people would listen to the science, but they did not. So hopefully that now it's unescapable and they'll have to act.
So I'll go on the religious question, and I think there's something really important, or one of the key things to think about when we talk about the influence of religion as inaction or used to justify inaction. I think it also comes down not only to a religious belief, so that this is somehow God saves. This is just a natural thing that the past God is taking us down. But I think it's when religion becomes something more than just for a person or a church. It's when it becomes connected to power. And in particular, when not simply religious leaders, but where a religious argument or the institution itself, or the co-option of religious values into a broader political game by a powerful group. And I think in this case, you can learn from, in the US, the Tea Party movement, but particularly how it not only focused on an extreme form of laissez-faire economics, particularly even going as far as what we call libertarian politics in some cases, but that also tied into an evangelical community in the US that focused on traditional and social values. social and cultural values that came together in essence. And when you put those two together, that's when you start to see how it connects to policy issues more explicitly, such as climate change. So I think it's when we think about religion and the religious component of it, I think it goes back to what Anna said about not tarnishing all religious people with the same brush, rather thinking about how religion can be co-opted and put as part of the political ground and political field.
Okay, next, Carlos. On Brazilian election, I love that question. So thank you, Kuhn, for the question. As we talked about the polarization of bringing climate to elections in Brazil, that's new for us. Bolsonaro brought that, and now is in the mix of the Brazilian politics. And I have no doubt will be a key topic at the next election, both climate, the low carbon economy path, whatever they're going to be doing, as well as what happened to the Amazon and deforestation, will be a hot political topic for the next election. And we have just done some opinion polls, and it's really, really interesting to show, first, the Brazilian population, differently again from the US, more than 82% of the Brazilian population do see climate change as an important topic. Brazil now wants the Amazon, 87% wants the next, whatever president, to protect the Amazon, and feels that the Amazon forest is part of the Brazilian identity as a nation. So back to the sovereignty issue. In last week, RAPS did some also opinion poll, but then with the parliamentarians in Brazil, and if it's around 80% of the population, for our representatives in parliament, when you ask about climate or protection of the Amazon, is around 10 to 20% of the Congress. So we have to make sure that those topics are translated, this will of the people is translated into votes. We have to vote for people that will defend. In the US, now between Biden and Trump, climate was a key issue. In Germany now, we saw was again a key issue. I have a certainty that there will be no difference in Brazil. As I mentioned, I know Bannon agrees with me that the Brazilian election will be key on the climate issue. And let's make sure that we are going to be able to mobilize and communicate with more people than he will and his followers. Thank you so much.
Thanks a million, Timmons, Ruth, and Anna, for this brilliant panel. I'll give up the floor to Luciana to say the final words. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Milani. First, I would like to invite Aline Soares for her final remarks, and then I'll come back for final announcements.
Thank you. In the name of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation Brazil, I would like to thank CEBRI for organizing this important debate. We all learned and participate in the high-level forum on issues on the great importance today. And we will keep very good impressions about the analysis made by each of the specialists that presented us different ideas in different contexts. I would like to congratulate the moderator, Carlos Milani, for conducting this debate, and our audience for their participation. And on behalf of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, I also would like to thank you, our guests, Professor Simons Roberts, Ruth McKee, and Anna Toni, for enriching these contributions. Thank you very much. Luciana, please.
Thank you, Aline. Thank you to Fundação Konrad Adenauer Foundation for the partnership. Thank you, Professor Milani, for moderating this conversation. And on behalf of CEBRI, I would like to give a very, very special thanks to Anna Toni, Professor Timmons, and Professor Ruth for this very fruitful debate. Thanks to our audience on Zoom and YouTube. And finally, before we close, I would like to invite all of you to the next debate of this project on October 28th. We will have Gonzalo Munoz, champion of COP26, Minister Isabela Teixeira, and Professor Daisy Ventura on a conversation about alliances for a new vision of the Anthropocene, which will also be led by Professor Milani. The invitation to this webinar will be sent soon, but you can already book on your agenda and follow all of CEBRI's activities, events, projects, and publication on our website. Thank you all for joining us today. Bye-bye, see you next time.
Thank you.
Everybody take care.